Hey guys, this is Joe Harper with Reformed Truther Ministry. The topic of today's video is the 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War was a religious and military conflict that raged in the Holy Roman Empire between 1618 and 1648 in modern-day Germany. This truly apocalyptic conflict was one of the most destructive wars in European history, and it became essentially a war for survival for the German Protestant princes as they found themselves facing a Roman Catholic onslaught that was determined to wipe out Protestantism from the Holy Roman Empire as part of their aims to establish the dominance of the Counter-Reformation over Europe, over the reign of the Roman Catholic monarchs and ultimately the papacy. The 30 Years' War began about a century after the official start of the Protestant Reformation in 1517 when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, Germany. The start of the Protestant Reformation had led to military conflicts and violence across Europe, and in many areas there was extreme religious violence and hatred, and Roman Catholicism saw the Protestant cause as heresy that had to be stamped out, and the Counter-Reformation was launched for these purposes. Protestants, even before the start of the 30 Years' War, found themselves fighting defensive wars for their survival in places such as the Netherlands, where the Dutch Calvinists were fighting a war of independence against the Roman Catholic Spanish Empire, and in the nation of France, in the French Wars of Religions, the French Calvinists, called the Huguenots, had been fighting a long struggle against the Roman Catholic monarchy and their allies that were trying to stamp out French Protestantism in the nation of France. The conflict in Germany and the Holy Roman Empire was centered around Ferdinand II of the Hapsburg Empire becoming the King of Bohemia, and he was a devout and even fanatical Roman Catholic and was dedicated to this progress of the Counter-Reformation and was a fanatical supporter of the Jesuit order, which was the leading order in regards to stamping out Protestantism across Europe. Ferdinand II was the king of Bohemia, but he was a member of the Hapsburg dynasty, and at this time in European history, the Habsburgs were the most powerful monarchical dynasty in Europe, with two separate branches to their royal family, one in Spain in the Spanish Empire, and then the Austrian branch that was in control of the Holy Roman Empire. The Habsburgs were devout Roman Catholics, and they saw the Protestants as heretics that needed to be destroyed and wiped out. And Ferdinand II at one point said that he would rather soon see his lands destroyed than allow heresy to be allowed to survive in his lands. And therefore he pledged himself and made a solemn vow, even before the Virgin Mary, to stamp out Protestantism in all areas of his lands. Now, prior to his ascension as the King of Bohemia, Germany had had a fragile peace for some years. In 1555, at the Peace of Augsburg, there had been a mediated settlement between the Protestant, mainly Lutheran princes and the Roman Catholic princes in the Holy Roman Empire, where each of the elector princes were allowed to have some level of autonomy in choosing what religion would prevail in their respective lands, and this was to be respected by the other princes. But the distrust between the Roman Catholics and the Protestants across Europe and the violence that was raging in other places meant that this fragile peace would inevitably would fail, and it would not be able to endure the strains that were put upon it by the designs of certain monarchs within the Holy Roman Empire who wanted to see only one religion prevail in their lands. In response to Ferdinand II being made the King of Bohemia, the Protestant nobles in Bohemia, which were numerous, were definitely afraid of Ferdinand II's aggressive religious fanaticism and what this would result for their kingdoms. They knew that he was determined to put an end to their freedom to worship God according to their own consciences, and They set it within themselves to take action preemptively in order to stop the oncoming persecution, where the signs of this were coming even at an early time. And therefore, this came to a head when, at what was called the Second Defenestration of Prague, a number of Protestant Bohemian nobles in the royal castle in Prague, after being in a heated exchange with the Roman Catholic representatives of Ferdinand II, the Protestant nobles took those Roman Catholic representatives of the Holy Roman Empire and threw them out the windows of the castle in an act of rebellion. And this sparked a Bohemian revolt against the reign of Ferdinand II. And the Protestant nobles in Bohemia, as a result of these historic events, they swung their support behind Frederick V of the Palatine, who was a Protestant, and they made him the King of Bohemia and hoped that he would be their leader who would be able to defend their hopes of freedom to worship God according to their consciences. Frederick V of the Palatine had been the leader of what had been called the Protestant League, and therefore he was the logical choice to be made the leader of Bohemia in this religious revolt. The political and military developments of the 30 Years' War can be somewhat complicated, but the war can be split into three phases. The first phase, being often called the Bohemian phase, lasted between 1618 and 1630. And this was the darkest phase for the Protestant cause, and this was the phase where the Roman Catholics had the most victories. The second phase was the Swedish phase, which lasted from 1630 to 1634, when the Swedes intervened in the war. And the final phase lasted between 1635 and 1648, often called the French phase, when the French sided against their fellow Roman Catholics and took the war against Spain and the Hapsburgs for their own political interests. Now, the Bohemian phase was the phase where the Roman Catholics under Ferdinand II and the Habsburgs worked to put down the revolt that had sprung up in Bohemia under the leadership of Frederick V of the Palatine. The Roman Catholics launched a military campaign into Bohemia and into the Palatine, and they were successful and able to put down the result, and they worked hard to eliminate Protestantism from Bohemia altogether. The Protestants suffered from disunity, where many of the Protestant princes in Germany, in the Holy Roman Empire, out of selfishness, cowardice, and self-preservation, did not want to intervene in support of their fellow Protestants in Bohemia, because they thought that if they took inaction and took a posture of neutrality, they would be left alone within their own electorates and own realm. So they failed to support their Protestant brethren in a time of need. As a result of this, the Roman Catholics were able to win a great victory over the Protestants at the Battle of White Mountain in 1620. And they continued to have military victories all across the Holy Roman Empire during the first phase of the war. And during this first phase, in these early years of the conflict, even though many Protestants fought valiantly against the Roman Catholics, it looked as though Protestantism may be stamped out of Germany completely forever. It was a dark time for the cause of Protestantism in these lands. In 1625, the Danes intervened in the war in support of their German allies, their fellow Protestants. And the Danes fought valiantly for the Protestant cause, but they too suffered defeats at the hands of the Hapsburgs and the Roman Catholics. Things looked very dark indeed until the second phase of the war began, when the Swedes, under the kingship of Gustavus Adolphus, now known to history as the Lion of the North, intervened in support of his fellow Protestants. Gustavus Adolphus was the king of Sweden, but he was also a devout Protestant. He was a Lutheran, and he was known as a man of prayer and personal piety. And he saw it as his religious duty and the will of God to come to the aid of his fellow Protestants in Germany. But he also saw this in the self-interest of Sweden, for he knew that if he failed to fight the Roman Catholics in Germany, that he would eventually find these same forces trying to stamp out his own religion in his own lands of Sweden. So it was a matter of bravery and integrity, but also of practical wisdom, to take the war to his enemies in Germany instead of waiting out of cowardice for these same threats to eventually find their way to his own doorstep in his own kingdom. Therefore, Gustavus Adolphus launched a campaign in northern Germany, and he was successful and able to turn the tide back in favor of the Protestants. He won many victories and was able to reconquer much of the German lands for the cause of the Protestants. One of his greatest victories came at the Battle of Breitenfeld, where he was able to successfully defeat the Hapsburg forces. But then his final battle came at the Battle of Lutzen, where the Swedes and the Habsburgs found themselves in a great conflict, and Gustavus Adolphus was eventually in this conflict. He was hit by musket balls and he was killed in battle. And the Swedes, even upon hearing of the death of their valiant and brave king, continued to fight even harder as a result of this, and the battle went all the way until the sun went down at dusk. And eventually the exhausted Roman Catholic forces under the command of the Hapsburgs were forced to abandon the field, including abandoning their own artillery and wounded, and the Swedes claimed victory in what had been a close-fought battle. Even after the death of Gustavus Adolphus, the Swedes continued to support their fellow Protestants in Germany, and this had essentially ensured the survival of Protestantism in the Holy Roman Empire, but it had come at a great cost. But then in 1635, in what became the final phase of the 30 Years' War, the French, under the kingship of Louis XIII of the Bourbon monarchy, and his foreign minister, Cardinal Richelieu, who is best known for his fictional portrayal in the novel The Three Musketeers, written by Alexandre Dumas, that they saw the growing Hapsburg dynasty as a threat to their own power in Europe. And instead of throwing their lot behind their fellow Roman Catholics, they decided to take the war against the Habsburg Empire in order to ensure their own power would survive in Europe. In the providence of God, this split between these two Roman Catholic dynasties gave the Protestants much needed breathing space. If the French had decided to throw their support behind the Spanish Empire and the Austrian Habsburgs instead of siding with the Protestants, it may have very well been the end of the Protestant cause in the Holy Roman Empire and perhaps even Europe as a whole. But due to these men's dynastic and political objectives, they put their own religion aside, even though the French had been fighting their own wars against Protestantism within their own lands. But instead, the Bourbons fought against the Habsburgs in the final phase of the war, and this led to the Spanish Empire being dangerously overextended. Both the Austrian Habsburgs and the Spanish Empire found themselves now fighting on a number of fronts across Europe, and the conflicts between the Spanish and the French continued even after the official end of the 30 Years' War in 1648 with the Treaty of Westphalia. The Treaty of Westphalia was finally signed in 1648, and it allowed peace to come in the Holy Roman Empire, but the devastation of this apocalyptic conflict had already been done. Certain towns in Germany had been completely wiped out altogether, and in some places it took literally generations for the population of Germany to recover from the losses of this 30 years long apocalyptic battle. But even though it had come at great cost and great sacrifice, the Protestants were able to secure their own survival and their own defense against the onslaught of the Counter-Reformation, and this was a badly needed victory in the cause of fighting for biblical Christianity across Europe. The 30 Years' War is an event which all true Christians should have some understanding of, because this great conflict where the Protestants were forced to fight for their survival against the onslaught of the Roman Catholic Hapsburg dynasty that ruled over the Holy Roman Empire at this time in history is an extremely important event in the history of Protestantism. And to be a true Christian, one must be, in one sense or another, a Protestant, or at the very least identify with the Protestant doctrines of sola scriptura, Scripture alone, and that salvation is by grace alone, through faith alone, in Jesus Christ alone, in a rejection of the false doctrines and traditions of man associated with the Church of Rome. That this great historical event where men such as Gustavus Adolphus, who many Protestants even to this very day remember as a hero, these men fought a gallant and brave defense for the survival of Protestantism, which amounts to the survival of true biblical Christianity. And due to these men's bravery and sacrifice, that Protestantism survived not only in the Holy Roman Empire, but in Europe as a whole. And as a result of these things, the Lord in his providence used these things for his own purpose. And in time, biblical Christianity, the Protestant cause, continued to advance not only across Europe, but across the world. So the 30 Years' War is an event that is well worth remembering. It is worth studying. It is worth having a remembrance of. We should remember what these men fought for the survival of Protestantism across the world. This is Joe Harper with Reformed Truther Ministries. God bless.